There's a strangely comforting feeling that comes from wandering through pieces of a world you thought you knew, only to discover that an entire corner of it was hidden from you the whole time. The Legend of Zelda is one of those worlds. And if you grew up with Link, or if you spent your childhood watching that tiny green hero sprint across TV screens, then you probably assumed the franchise existed neatly in the form you experienced it. Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess. You know, the familiar landmarks that shaped entire gaming generations. But buried deep in Zelda's history are adventures that almost feel imaginary, like pieces of a dream you half remember, or stories someone once told you in passing, but you never thought were real. And yet, they were real. You just never got to see them. Tonight, we're going to wander through those forgotten corners, quietly, slowly, as if walking through a dusty attic filled with Zelda memories that never made it to the West. Some of these games lived for only a brief moment. Some lived inside a machine that barely existed outside Japan. Some aired on a satellite service that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. But they all mattered. They all belong to Zelda's history. And for the first time, we'll explore them together. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift gently into the softest, strangest part of Zelda's past. The Japanese exclusive games that never crossed the ocean. The era of the Satellaview, Zelda's broadcast adventure. To understand these forgotten Zelda games, you first need to imagine something unusual, something that sounds almost magical by today's standards. In the mid-1990s, Nintendo released a device in Japan called the Satellaview. It wasn't a cartridge. It wasn't a disc. It wasn't even something you could hold a physical copy of. It was a satellite broadcast service. Yes, Zelda games used to be broadcast through the sky. Players connected their Super Famicom to a receiver, and at specific times of day, Nintendo literally beamed games down to them through satellite signals. You had to tune in at the exact right moment, like a TV show. If you missed the broadcast, the game was simply gone. It's one of those ideas that feels far too dreamy to have ever existed. But it did, and that's where the first lost Zelda game appears. BS Zelda no Densetsu, a reimagining that floated through the air. The first Satellaview. Zelda was called BS Zelda no Densetsu, or roughly, Broadcast Satellite Zelda. And if the name feels strange, the game itself was even stranger. It wasn't exactly a brand new adventure. It wasn't exactly the original Zelda either. It sat somewhere in between. A complete remake of the NES classic, but rebuilt with Super Nintendo graphics, new layouts, new events, and a multiplayer community-driven twist. Not multiplayer in the real-time sense, but in the sense that thousands of Japanese players were all receiving the same game at the same time and hearing the same live narration through the satellite audio stream. Imagine playing Zelda while a voice actor, a literal narrator, spoke to you over the broadcast. Monsters have become stronger. Treasure appears in the east. A mysterious event begins now. This wasn't a soundtrack. It was a live performance. Every player across Japan heard the same announcements at the same moment, giving the game a kind of communal heartbeat. You weren't just playing Zelda. You were participating in a broadcast. It was a fleeting experience, temporary by design. A Legend of Zelda that existed only in the present tense. Once the broadcast was over, the world of BS Zelda disappeared with it. For many, it became a ghost. A piece of history no one could play again, unless they had recorded the broadcast onto special Satellaview memory packs. And that's why the West never saw it. By the time Zelda became global, the Satellaview itself had already faded away. BS Zelda. Ancient stone tablets. the sequel that shouldn't exist, but does. If the first Satellaview Zelda feels like a miracle, the second one feels like a secret. BS Zelda. Ancient Stone Tablets is a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, something fans had dreamed of for years but never thought would ever exist. Except it did exist. Just not for us. Broadcast in 4 weekly episodes, each lasting exactly 1 hour, Ancient Stone Tablets brought players back to the world of A Link to the Past. Same art style, same engine, same music, but with new dungeons, new dialogue, new mysteries, and a new protagonist who wasn't Link at all. Because here's the strangest twist. You didn't play as Link. You played as the Satellaview avatar, a male or female hero representing you, the player receiving the broadcast. This wasn't just a cute gimmick. It was part of the Satellaview's whole identity. The service treated you as the adventurer. And because the game aired like a television show, the world changed every week. New chapters, new events, timed battles, treasure hunts, voice-acted narration guiding players through the hour-long episode. Imagine Zelda structured like a limited TV series, 4 episodes, once per week, and if you weren't tuned in to your Super Famicom at the exact right time, you missed it forever. Ancient Stone Tablets was not a cartridge you could buy. It was not a disc you could download. It was an experience broadcast once, carried through the air, and then erased. Nintendo never re-released it. Not on Wii, not on Switch, not on Virtual Console. It lives now only through fan reconstructions, dedicated players piecing together data fragments, recorded audio, and saved broadcasts to resurrect what was otherwise lost. A Zelda sequel most of the world never got to see. Why these games never came to America. It's easy to imagine an alternate timeline where Nintendo localized these games, bundled them into a collection, or remade them for future systems. But the reality is much less glamorous. By the time Nintendo even considered international expansion, the entire Satellaview service had died. The hardware was outdated. The broadcasts had ceased. And the games themselves weren't complete files. They relied on timed audio streams that no longer existed. Without the original satellite infrastructure, Nintendo couldn't reassemble the games in a faithful way. And they didn't try. That's why these games remain Japanese exclusives. They were never physical. They aired temporarily. They relied on live audio. And they were built for a service only Japan had access to. They were meant to be ephemeral. Moments in time rather than games on a shelf. In a way, that's what makes them beautiful. And in another way, it makes them tragic. Zelda stories that lived in the sky, broadcast once, and then vanished. As we drift out of Section 1, that's the quiet truth of the first chapter in Zelda's forgotten history. Games that floated into existence through satellite signals lingered for only a few evenings, and then faded into memory. When you close your eyes and imagine them now, they feel almost mythical, like lost scrolls of Hyrule that were never meant to be held, only glimpsed. We've uncovered the first layer of Zelda's hidden past. When you're ready, we'll move on to the next. The Tingle games that never reached America. A strange, warm corner of Zelda history. There's a certain softness to the forgotten corners of Zelda history, a feeling that some stories live on the edges simply because they were never meant to be seen by everyone. And nowhere is that feeling stronger than in the strange, colorful, unapologetically odd world of Tingle. If you know him, you probably remember him as that slightly unsettling man in a green suit, floating across the fields of Termina, selling maps for outrageous prices. Some players loved him, some didn't. But Nintendo noticed something unusual in Japan. People were fascinated by him. Tingle was never designed to become a star. And yet, he did. Not in America, not in Europe, but in Japan. Tingle grew from a side character into something like a curious cultural phenomenon. Strange, playful, unexpected. And because of that, Japan received games we never got. Games that lived full lives on the Nintendo DS, but never came west, as if they belonged to a separate timeline. Tonight, we're going to drift into that timeline and explore the forgotten trilogy of Tingle adventures that the rest of the world only heard rumors about. Take a breath, get comfortable, and let's wander into the whimsical little world of the man in green. The first surprise: Tingle's Balloon Fight DS. It's almost funny to think about now. The first major Japanese exclusive Tingle game wasn't even an adventure or a puzzle or a parody. It was a remake of Balloon Fight. Yes, the old Nintendo arcade-style classic. But instead of the original Balloon Fighters, the main character was Tingle. The game wasn't sold in stores. It wasn't a normal release. You couldn't buy it anywhere. It was distributed exclusively through Club Nintendo Japan, the points-based reward system. Only Japanese fans with enough points could claim it, and once the reward period ended, that was it. No reprints, no digital versions. Just gone. Players described it as charming in its own bizarre way. The gameplay was almost exactly like Balloon Fight, but the visuals were colorful and Tingle-themed, filled with sparkles and surreal touches that only made sense if you embraced the character's eccentric nature. For most of the world, this game doesn't even feel real. A Tingle Balloon Fight? On DS? Locked behind a loyalty program? But that's the thing about Zelda's Japanese exclusives. They were often joyful experiments meant only for the fans who loved the weird side of Nintendo. Freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, the adventure we never got. And then there was the big one. The game that almost made it out of Japan, but didn't. The game reviewers talked about for years afterward. The game that some fans still swear is one of the strangest and funniest RPGs Nintendo ever made. Freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land. This wasn't a mini-game. This wasn't a novelty reward. It was a full, expansive adventure, a genuine Zelda-like, built entirely around Tingle. Except in this world, Tingle wasn't Tingle yet. He was a middle-aged man who hadn't found meaning in life. A man who, one day, heard a magical voice promising him that wealth could bring happiness. And so, he set off on a journey to a glittering paradise called Rupee Land, a dream world built entirely out of money. Yes, money. In Rosy, Rupee Land, the economy is the gameplay. You don't attack enemies the traditional way. You throw money to influence battles. You don't unlock items by exploring. You buy them. Everything, from progress to power, is paid for in rupees. The entire game is a satire wrapped in an adventure, a commentary on greed and desire hidden beneath goofy dialogue and colorful characters. Tingle dances, he bargains, he gets swindled, he flirts disastrously, he solves puzzles and bribes monsters and sinks deeper into a world where everyone has a price. And somehow, it all works. Rosy Rupee Land received solid reviews, especially in Europe, where it did get released. But for reasons only Nintendo knows, America never saw it. Some speculate the humor was too strange, too culturally specific. Others think Nintendo worried American players wouldn't get it. Whatever the reason, the US never got the chance to experience one of the most uniquely creative Zelda-adjacent games ever made. The sequel that got even stranger, Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. And then came the sequel. Even weirder, even more personal, even more entrenched in the whimsical corners of Japanese humor. ripened Tingle's balloon trip of love. Where Rosy Rupiland was an adventure built on money, Balloon Trip of Love was a storytelling experiment, essentially a parody of old romantic adventure games, the kind that blurred the lines between dating sims and point-and-click mysteries. The story opens with Tingle being whisked away into a fairy tale book world. Inside, he is expected to find love through a journey of challenges, puzzles, awkward conversations, and moments that range from sweet to bizarre. The tone is soft, comedic, and intentionally tongue-in-cheek. It pokes fun at fairy tales and at Tingle himself, a man trying far too hard to be charming. The structure resembles classic Japanese adventure games, room to room, scene to scene, solving puzzles through dialogue and logic rather than action. Some moments are genuinely heartfelt, others are surreal enough to feel like dreams. This game, too, never left Japan. Fan translations exist now, but the official version remains locked in a little cultural bubble where Tingle was beloved enough to headline his own parody romance quest. It's the kind of game that could only have existed on the DS, a small, cozy, strange slice of imagination. Why the West never received these Tingle games? The simplest answer is that Nintendo wasn't sure the Western audience was ready for Tingle-based humor. He was a cult favorite in Japan, but in America, he was more of a meme before memes existed, a character players joked about rather than celebrated. Nintendo of America played it safe. They passed. By the time Rosy Rupiland released in Europe, the DS era was crowded with new experiments and franchises. There was no clear moment to introduce Tingle's surreal adventures to the US market. And Balloon Trip of Love? That one never even came close. Nintendo likely saw it as too niche, too odd, too gentle and strange for the mainstream American crowd. But that's exactly what makes these games special. They are little pockets of warmth and oddity. Games that feel like bedtime stories told by someone with a mischievous sense of humor, charming, strange, and quietly meaningful. And somewhere in those DS cartridges lives a part of Zelda history that most of the world never touched. As we drift out of Section 2, the world of Tingle is dreamy in its own peculiar way, a place full of sparkles and earnest awkwardness, where rupees buy everything, and love is a puzzle that never quite solves itself. Tonight, we visited a piece of Zelda's past that feels almost impossible, a series of games built around a character who was never meant to be important, and yet ended up starring in some of Nintendo's most unusual creations. These games sit quietly in the shadowed corners of the franchise's history, waiting for anyone curious enough to dig them up, and patient enough to appreciate their soft, playful, strange charm. If you're ready, we'll drift into Section 3 together, Navi Trackers, the Zelda mode the world forgot. But first tell me, are you happy with this section, or would you like me to adjust anything before continuing? Navi Trackers, the Zelda mode, the world forgot. There are corners of Zelda's history that feel so quiet, so barely documented, that discovering them is like stumbling across a dusty little room in a familiar house, a room you never knew existed, even though you've lived there for years. One of those forgotten rooms is something called Navi Trackers, a Zelda experience so peculiar that even longtime fans sometimes question whether it ever really happened. But it did. It existed. And it lived inside the Nintendo GameCube in a way that almost feels like a secret whispered into the console rather than a game placed on a disc. Tonight, we're going to wander into that hidden place, softly, slowly, and explore one of the strangest Zelda experiments Nintendo ever created. So let's settle in, let's lean back, and let's slip into the odd little world of Navi Trackers, the Zelda mode that only 2 countries ever got to see. a Zelda game that only lived in Japan and South Korea. To understand Navi trackers, you have to imagine a time when the GameCube was new, when Link's cel-shaded face from the Wind Waker was still surprising the gaming world. Nintendo was experimenting in ways it rarely does anymore. They were merging systems, blending hardware, trying strange cross-device ideas that only made sense in that era. And tucked inside that era was a special mode included with Four Swords Adventures, but only in Japan and South Korea. Everywhere else in the world, the disc was missing something called Navi trackers. If you grew up outside those regions, your copy of Four Swords Adventures had a gap where an entire mode should have been. The menu just jumped from one thing to another. No mention of it. No explanation. As if the mode never existed. But in Japan and Korea, the game's menu had an extra shimmering selection, almost like a door to a room the rest of the world never unlocked. That room was Navi Trackers. Navi Trackers wasn't just a mode, it was its own game calling. Navi Trackers, a mode, almost feels unfair. It was a standalone experience tucked inside a collection. A complete adventure built around its own rules, art style, and its own kind of magic. Instead of controlling Link in a traditional sense, players use their Game Boy Advance, connected to the GameCube with the little Link cable that feels like ancient treasure now. Each GBA acted like a private screen, while the TV showed the big map, a hybrid way of playing long before the Wii U or the Switch dreamed of doing something similar. And at the center of it all was Navi, acting as your guide, your announcer, and your narrator, except not in text, not in subtitles. She spoke, out loud, with full voice acting. Nintendo gave Navi a microphone and let her talk directly to the players, encouraging them, scolding them, cheering them on, almost like a game show host. It didn't feel like Zelda. It felt like a highlight reel from a parallel universe. A race through Hyrule, guided by a voice in the sky. The idea behind Navi trackers was simple, but it felt revolutionary. Players ran around a huge map, searching for stamps, little markers representing characters from the Wind Waker. Tingle, Hyrule, Beetle, the pirates. They all had their own stamps to find. When a player grabbed a stamp, Navi would call their name out loud. If someone fell behind, she'd tease them gently, pushing them to catch up. If someone slipped into the lead, she'd announce it like a sportscaster. The entire game unfolded like a live event, part scavenger hunt, part competition, part narrated performance. The closest thing to it wasn't another Zelda title. It was something Nintendo EAD had made years earlier, a strange, experimental game called Marvelous, another treasure island. Navi Trackers, in fact, was originally built as a Marvelous sequel, and only later reskinned into a Zelda experience. That's why the tone feels so different. Why it feels more whimsical, more playful, more experimental. It wasn't born as Zelda. It was adopted into Zelda, and that adoption makes the mode feel like a lost cousin, familiar, but not quite part of the main family. Why Navi Trackers never released worldwide? You'd think that such a unique, ambitious idea would have made waves across the globe. But instead, Navi Trackers evaporated almost as soon as it appeared. The reason? Localization. The mode relied heavily on voice acting, dozens of voice lines, game show-style narration that responded to players in real time. To release the game worldwide, Nintendo would have needed to translate and re-record all those voices, not just for English-speaking regions, but for many languages. For each region, Navi would need to call out player names, announce changes in scoring, read random events, and react to time-sensitive situations. And this wasn't just a handful of lines. This was an entire commentary track for a mode that was only a small part of a larger game. The cost didn't make sense. Nintendo quietly removed Navi trackers from the international version of Four Swords Adventures. Most players never even realized something was missing, and so the mode slipped away, preserved only in 2 countries. What it feels like to play Navi trackers today. If you ever watch footage of Navi trackers from the Japanese or Korean version, you'll notice something rare. The game feels alive. Not in the story sense, in the interactive sense. It reacts to you. It comments on you. It acknowledges you in a way Zelda games rarely do. The GBA screen shows your private journey, while the TV screen becomes a public stage. Navi ties the two together, weaving her voice around the players like a ribbon. It's chaotic but warm, competitive but friendly, loud but charming in a way only a mid-2000s Nintendo experiment could be. There's nothing else quite like it. Not before, not after. It's Zelda, but sideways. Zelda, but playful. Zelda, but performed. And because the mode is trapped in a regional release, it feels almost like an artifact from a different dimension, a glimpse of a direction the series could have explored, but chose not to. The last echo of a forgotten idea. In the years since, fans have tried to preserve Navi trackers through emulation, patching, and archive work. It's not easy. The mode depends on specific hardware interactions, voice triggers, and event timing that can't be perfectly recreated. But even in fragmented form, its charm survives, a reminder that Zelda isn't just epic fantasy and ancient legends. Sometimes, Zelda is a strange little experiment with a pixie shouting encouragement while you search for tingle stamps with your friends. It's comforting in its own way. Soft, lighthearted, almost nostalgic for something you never experienced. And that's what makes Navi trackers so fascinating. Not because it was big, not because it was essential, but because it shows a side of Nintendo that still dreamed fearlessly, the side that experimented simply because it could. As we leave, Section 3. Behind. We've wandered through a part of Zelda history that most people never even knew was missing. A lost hybrid of Marvelous, Zelda, the GameCube, and the GBA, fused together in an experiment that barely touched the world before fading away. Next, if you're ready, we'll drift gently into Section 4, where we step out of the games themselves and walk into a story. The life of Eiji Aonuma, the woodcarver who would quietly reshape the future of Zelda. The woodcarver who reshaped Zelda. A gentle journey through the early life of Eiji Aonuma. If you've spent enough time wandering through the worlds of Zelda, you've felt Eiji Aonuma's touch, even if you never knew his name. His fingerprints rest gently on dungeons, on puzzles, on strange little characters tucked into corners of Hyrule. His ideas ripple through Wind Waker's sweeping seas, Majora's melancholy moon, and Breath of the Wild's open skies. But Aonuma didn't set out to become one of Nintendo's most influential creators. He didn't even intend to work in video games. His story begins somewhere quieter, somewhere more tactile, in the world of wood, tools, and imagination shaped with bare hands. Tonight, we're going to let his journey unfold slowly, like a memory returning piece by piece. No rush, no sharp turns, just a gentle drift through the early life of the man who would one day help reinvent one of the most beloved series in gaming. Let's start at the beginning. A quiet childhood, surrounded by craft. Aonuma grew up in Japan, in a home where practicality and creativity shared the same table. His father worked as a furniture maker, a man who shaped the world not with ideas or sketches, but with wood and tools and patient effort. the kind of work that leaves sawdust on the floor and the smell of fresh lumber in the air. As a child, Aonuma spent hours watching him. The precision, the care, the transformation of raw material into something useful, something beautiful. Those early moments mattered more than anyone realized at the time. He wasn't thinking about games back then. He was thinking about shapes, patterns, textures, the way something could exist in your mind before it ever existed in the world. He learned that creation wasn't a sudden spark. It was a slow, deliberate act. This would become a quiet foundation that his future would stand on. The college years, when wood turned into puppets. When Aonuma went to college at the Tokyo University of the Arts, he didn't choose a glamorous field or a path filled with career stability. He gravitated toward design, specifically toward crafting wooden marionettes called karakuri puppets, traditional mechanical puppets capable of moving through intricate internal mechanisms. He built them not because he wanted to perform with them, but because he was fascinated by the idea of bringing still material to life. Taking wood, something rigid, silent, solid, and giving it motion. As he studied movement and mechanics, Aonuma wasn't thinking about video game design. He had barely played games. He was thinking about the relationship between a creator and creation, how an artist might breathe invisible emotion into physical form. And he wasn't just average at it. His professors admired his work. He had a vision, a way of thinking in three-dimensional space that made his puppets feel expressive and alive. In those quiet classrooms and wood shops, Aonuma learned something essential: how to design characters that move meaningfully. He didn't know it yet, but this would become the heart of Zelda's evolution decades later. The unexpected path. Nintendo notices The Puppeteer. After graduating, Aonuma continued building puppets, hoping to enter the world of art and craftsmanship. He didn't see himself fitting into a corporate structure. He wanted to create, not manage. Imagine that. One of the most important game designers of all time started his career thinking he would stay in the world of handcrafted wooden figures. But then something surprising happened. His work caught the attention of Nintendo. It wasn't because he applied for a game designer position. It wasn't because he showed game prototypes. It was because someone at Nintendo saw his wooden automatons and realized that the imagination required to build those puppets, the way they moved, the way they expressed themselves, was valuable. A human being who could bring wood to life could probably bring pixels to life too. Aonuma didn't fully understand what they wanted from him at first. He wasn't a gamer. He didn't even know what kind of work game development involved. But Nintendo saw potential, and Aonuma, quietly curious, accepted their invitation. He stepped into their Kyoto headquarters not as a Zelda fan, but as an artist learning a new medium. And that's where everything changed. The first steps inside Nintendo. When Aonuma joined Nintendo, he didn't begin by designing heroes or legends or vast worlds. Instead, he entered one of the company's development groups, the ones overseen by Shigeru Miyamoto, and started small. Very small. Early on, he worked on projects like NES Open Tournament Golf, a far cry from the fantasy landscapes he would later help craft. But that assignment was intentional. Nintendo didn't throw him into the deep end. They let him observe the way games behaved, the way code and animation merged together, the way game mechanics were built from the ground up. For Aonuma, the experience was strange, almost foreign. But it wasn't overwhelming. It was just different. And then he discovered something. Even though he'd never worked with digital art before, the foundational skills from his years crafting puppets immediately translated. The sense of motion, the attention to detail, the instinct for making interactions feel right. He had spent years making wooden figures move naturally. Animating characters in a game was just another form of performance. Little by little, Aonuma became more comfortable. Nintendo wasn't just a technology company. It was a place that valued imagination, emotion, and craft. It was, in many ways, the perfect place for someone like him. The moment that would change everything. A link to the past. Aonuma's quiet journey into game design took a sharp turn the day he played The Legend of Zelda. A link to the past for the first time. Remember, he hadn't grown up playing Zelda. This was his first real exposure, and it hit him like a revelation. The sense of adventure, the atmosphere, the puzzles, the feeling of stepping into a living story shaped by your actions. It moved him. In his own words, he said he was blown away. That he never imagined games could be that expressive, that emotionally rich, that full of personality and craft. He felt something click inside him, something that told him, this is the kind of world I want to build. That moment wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fireworks or epiphanies. It was just a soft internal shift, the kind that changes the direction of a person's life without them fully realizing it until years later. His fascination with puppetry, performance, mechanical expression suddenly felt connected to something bigger, something digital, something interactive, something alive. Zelda showed him what games could be, and he wanted to be part of that. Marvelous. His first true adventure. Before he touched Zelda, Aonuma was given a chance to direct his own game, a quirky, charming, puzzle-filled SNES title called Marvelous, another treasure island. In many ways, it felt like a prototype for the future of Zelda. Puzzle-focused, character-driven, fluid camera work, a sense of playful exploration. Marvelous didn't make global waves, but internally at Nintendo, it said one very important thing. Aonuma wasn't just skilled. He had vision. He could craft worlds. He could guide a team. He could design experiences that felt rich and lived in. And quietly, without him knowing, this placed him on the collision course with the series he had admired from afar. It was the game that put him on Miyamoto's radar, a little gem that whispered, "This is someone who can handle bigger things." And bigger things were coming. The door opens, Aonuma's first steps into the Zelda universe. Very long, atmospheric, bedtime conversational, all facts preserved. Before Aonuma ever touched the Zelda franchise, he was still very much the quiet artist inside Nintendo, the one who carved puppets, the one who studied mechanics, the one who made games move with a certain rhythm that felt almost handcrafted. Marvelous. Another treasure island had proven he could direct a full project, but he wasn't yet standing in the shadow of Hyrule. Not yet. That world lived somewhere slightly above him, like a legendary mountaintop only a few creators were allowed to climb. But sometimes life slips quietly toward its turning points, the way the tide shifts without you noticing. And that's how Zelda entered Aonuma's life. Not as an assignment, not as a mandate, more like a gradual invitation. Inside Nintendo, games were always in motion, prototypes being tested, engines being built, experimental ideas bouncing around between teams. The atmosphere wasn't pressure-filled, it was curious. Ideas floated around like dust in sunlight, drifting until they found the right person to land on. One day, one of those ideas drifted toward Aonuma. He had just wrapped up work on smaller contributions, things like NES Open Tournament Golf, projects that taught him about structure and deadlines and the very particular way Nintendo built its games. He still wasn't a Zelda expert. In fact, most of the staff who'd been there since the Famicom era had grown up alongside the franchise. Aonuma wasn't part of that original circle. He was an outsider stepping towards something sacred. But he had one advantage that very few people in the building had. He truly saw a link to the past. It wasn't nostalgia for him. It wasn't childhood memory. It was awe. The moment he finished that game, it lodged itself in him like a spark. It wasn't the combat or the bosses or the lore. It was the way everything in Zelda fit together. The way puzzles felt like conversations between the game and the player. The way spaces unfolded thoughtfully. The way exploration rewarded curiosity instead of punishing it. He recognized craft. He recognized intention. And he wanted to be part of whatever made that possible. So when Nintendo needed people to help shape the future of Zelda, not yet Ocarina of Time, not yet Majora, Aonuma began drifting into that orbit. At first, he didn't know he was being watched. Miyamoto, the creator of Zelda himself, observed newcomers like a master craftsman studying apprentices. He wasn't looking for technical brilliance. He was looking for sensibility, the ability to feel how a world should move, how a character should breathe, how a puzzle should surprise. Aonuma had that, even if he didn't realize it yet. Marvelous. The prototype of Zelda's future Marvelous was a turning point, even though it never achieved mainstream fame. It had this playful structure. A group of kids solving puzzles together, interacting with the world in a way that felt tactile and deliberate. Dungeons weren't just rooms with locked doors. They were spaces that responded to cleverness, to observation, to patience. After Marvelous released, Nintendo noticed something very subtle. Aonuma had an instinct for how players explore. He understood puzzle language. He understood pacing. He understood how to build mystery without making the player feel lost. Marvelous wasn't Zelda, but it felt like a cousin, and that resemblance caught Miyamoto's attention. So this person understands adventure, Miyamoto thought, not just level design, adventure. That distinction would change Aonuma's life. The invitation. Quiet, but life-changing. One day, almost casually, Aonuma was informed that another team needed his help, a team working on something far bigger, far more ambitious. A project that was attempting to take Zelda into a dimension the series had never explored. The words sounded simple, almost routine, but the meaning beneath them was monumental. We'd like you to join the Zelda team. It wasn't a request you refused. It wasn't a door you turned away from. It was an invitation into one of Nintendo's most revered inner circles. But for Aonuma, it wasn't simply an honor. It felt like stepping into a place he had admired from afar, like entering a home whose architecture he already understood intuitively, even if he'd never lived in it. Still, he had doubts. He wasn't sure he could meet the expectations. He wasn't sure he belonged among creators who'd been shaping Zelda since the beginning. He wondered if he was just the puppeteer experimenting in digital worlds. He wondered if his handmade sensibility would translate to one of the biggest franchises in the world. But that's the thing about Aonuma. His uncertainty never stopped him. He walked forward anyway, quietly, steadily, prepared to learn. The beginning. Before the beginning. Learning Zelda's language. Aonuma didn't immediately start designing dungeons or shaping storylines. Instead, he spent a long time observing how Zelda worked from the inside. He watched how the team built rooms not as isolated puzzles, but as parts of a rhythm, a rising and falling sequence that created flow. He learned how items acted not just as tools, but as metaphors, each one representing a new form of interaction with the world. He studied how enemies telegraphed behavior, how bosses communicated patterns, how secrets remained visible enough to be fair, yet hidden enough to feel magical. He began to understand that Zelda wasn't built on difficulty. It was built on clarity, on intuition, on the simple joy of discovering, so that's how this works. He connected deeply with this philosophy. It matched the puppet work he used to do. Mechanical movement, driven by emotional instinct. And slowly, the team began giving him more responsibility. At first, it was small ideas, a design for a room, a sequence for a puzzle, a suggestion for how an object should behave. But each idea Aonuma produced carried that same handcrafted precision. Not technical brilliance, emotional precision. He had a feel for Zelda, and that feel made him invaluable. Standing at the threshold of Ocarina of Time. By the time the Zelda team began developing Ocarina of Time, Aonuma wasn't an outsider anymore. He was becoming one of the architects. He wasn't directing yet. He wasn't producing yet. But he was shaping the internal structure of what Zelda would become. Ocarina of Time would become a monumental task. One that needed minds capable of imagining space in 3 dimensions, motion in 3 dimensions, puzzles in 3 dimensions. And who better than the puppeteer who understood how to bring wooden figures into motion? Aonuma became essential. His understanding of movement, of mechanics, of emotional rhythm, all of it translated perfectly into the world of Hyrule as it transformed into 3D for the first time. He was ready. He had arrived, and nothing in his life would ever be the same. As Section 5 settles into stillness, we've traveled through the quiet doorway of Aonuma's career, the years before the spotlight, before the iconic games, before he reshaped Zelda into the form the world knows today. Next, in Section 6, we step into the era where everything changes: Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and the creative storm that turned Aonuma from a promising designer into one of the most important minds in Nintendo's history. The Ocarina era, how Aonuma helped shape a legend and survive Majora's one-year storm, very long, conversational, atmospheric, fall asleep to narrative, all facts preserved. By the time Eiji Aonuma stepped into the heart of Ocarina of Time's development, Zelda was no longer just a beloved series. It was something larger, a cultural promise. Gamers all around the world were waiting for the first fully 3D Zelda experience, expecting it to feel as magical as the 2D adventures they had grown up with. For Nintendo, the pressure was immense. For the design team, it must have felt like standing in the center of a storm, one made of expectations, excitement, and the fear of stepping into completely uncharted territory. Aonuma, still relatively new to Zelda, found himself standing right inside that storm, and in a very quiet, almost unnoticeable way. He became one of the minds that helped the storm take shape. Learning to think in 3D. Ocarina of Time wasn't just big. It wasn't just ambitious. It was something the world had never seen before. A fantasy world unfolding in full 3D space. It wasn't enough to build rooms or puzzles the way they'd always been built. Everything had to be reimagined from the ground up. For Aonuma, this was strangely familiar. Moving puppets required understanding mechanics and spatial logic. Bringing marionettes to life meant imagining how limbs moved, how weight shifted, how expressions changed through motion. Translating that sense of movement into 3D gameplay wasn't easy, but it was natural for him. He didn't see dungeons as collections of rooms. He saw them as performances. Every switch, every platform, every rotating staircase, every shifting wall, they weren't just obstacles. They were part of a choreography, a dance the player moved through. Aonuma understood how to shape that dance. So he designed dungeons. Beautiful, complex, multi-layered places where movement and motivation intertwined. His work in Ocarina of Time was so impressive that he quickly became one of the most important dungeon creators on the project. But with great challenges came mistakes, and one of them would become infamous. The Water Temple. A beautiful headache. If you've ever heard someone joke about Zelda difficulty, you've probably heard about the Water Temple. It wasn't meant to be punishing. Aonuma didn't design it to frustrate anyone. In fact, he built it with a kind of mathematical elegance, a multi-level puzzle connected by rising and falling water levels, designed to make the player feel clever for navigating its layers. But here's the truth, Aonuma later admitted with a grin. He didn't realize how difficult it would be to manage in 3D space, switching iron boots from the pause menu, navigating water at different depths, keeping mental track of vertical paths, trying to remember which doors led where. It all stacked up in a way he didn't fully anticipate. Years later, he would look back on interviews and say he understood why players felt stuck, why they wandered for hours, why they grew frustrated, why they both loved and cursed the dungeon in equal measure. But at the time, he was proud of it. And honestly, he still is. Because despite its difficulty, the Water Temple taught him something. Zelda wasn't just about puzzles, it was about communication. A dungeon should feel like a conversation between the designer and the player, not a test of patience. Aonuma carried that lesson forward. Majora's Mask, a dream with a 1-year deadline. After Ocarina of Time shipped, the world was stunned. The game became an instant legend. But inside Nintendo, there wasn't time to celebrate. Miyamoto wanted a sequel, fast, not in 4 years, not in 3, not even in 2. He wanted it in 1. Most people would call that impossible. Most companies wouldn't even try. But this is where Aonuma stepped forward. Miyamoto told him, "If you can make a new Zelda in 1 year, you can direct it." It was both a challenge and a test, and Aonuma accepted. Majora's Mask wasn't built from scratch. The team reused Ocarina's engine. They reused models. They kept the foundation intact. But everything built on top of that foundation was new, and it came from Aonuma's imagination. And because he had so little time, he had no choice but to think differently. He designed a looping world, a world that rewound itself every 3 days, a world where characters followed schedules like clockwork, a world where stories could be layered without needing dozens of new maps. Majora's Mask became a puzzle of time, emotion, and connection. But make no mistake, the development was brutal. Aonuma later said he barely slept. The team pushed themselves to the edge. They worked with urgency, creativity, desperation, and pure instinct. They built a game that felt like a fever dream because they themselves were living inside one. And yet, against all odds, Majora's Mask wasn't just completed. It became a masterpiece. Dark, melancholic, timeless, unlike any Zelda before or after. And it began Aonuma's rise from promising designer to true creative force. The toll on his life, and the turning point during Majora's development, Aonuma became a father. He wanted to be present. He wanted to be there for his family. But the deadlines didn't allow it. He found himself torn between the demands of creation and the demands of love. He later admitted that this was one of the most difficult periods of his life. He would come home exhausted, sleep for a few hours, and go back to the office. Day after day, week after week. Majora's Mask wasn't just a game. It was a weight he carried emotionally and physically. But it also changed him. It made him understand something fundamental about Zelda. The emotional core matters as much as the adventure. Majora's Mask, with its themes of loss, fear, loneliness, and hope, wasn't just a reflection of a fictional world. It was a reflection of Aonuma's own life at the time. The pressure, the exhaustion, the desire to make something meaningful, the awareness that time was always slipping away. You can feel those emotions woven into every inch of the game. Aonuma emerges as the future of Zelda. Majora's Mask proved something important to Nintendo. Aonuma wasn't just a talented designer. He was a leader, a visionary, someone capable of guiding Zelda into new forms without losing its soul. After Majora, he became more involved in shaping the franchise itself, not just the puzzles, not just the dungeons, but the themes, the tone, the direction. He moved from craftsman to architect, from participant to director, from puppeteer to storyteller. The Ocarina and Majora era wasn't just about the games he worked on. It was about Aonuma discovering who he was as a creator and discovering what Zelda could become under his guidance, and the world had no idea yet how much he would change things. The Wind Waker era, a soft rebellion, a storm of backlash, and the beauty that outlived it all. By the time Aonuma stepped into what would become the Wind Waker, Zelda had already climbed to impossible heights. Ocarina of Time was a masterpiece. Majora's Mask was bold and strange and unforgettable, and fans expected the next Zelda to follow the path Ocarina had carved, darker, more realistic, pushing further toward cinematic fantasy. Nintendo could have done that. They could have followed the obvious road. But that wasn't their way. Deep inside the company, something else had been growing, a need to break expectations, to stretch the edges of Zelda's world instead of tracing the same outline again. And somewhere in that creative tension, Aonuma found himself at the helm of a quiet rebellion, a rebellion made of color and curves and expressions so alive they almost breathed. This rebellion would become the Wind Waker. Aonuma's bold vision, a Zelda that smiles. The earliest versions of the next Zelda looked exactly like fans expected. Realistic proportions, darker tones, a continuation of the Ocarina style. The prototype was impressive. It was serious. It was ambitious. And Aonuma hated it. Not because it lacked quality, not because it lacked potential, but because it felt like imitation. He didn't want to simply copy Ocarina. He wanted something that felt like a step forward, not in graphics, but in personality. One day, while the team was experimenting with art tests, someone showed him a cartoonish Link sketch. Big eyes, round head, expressive eyebrows. A style that felt less like a video game and more like a living illustration. Aonuma looked at that sketch, and something inside him lit up. He saw possibilities. He saw charm. He saw a version of Link who could finally express real emotion. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question the risk. That, he said, that's the direction. This decision would change his life. The backlash, when fans rejected the dream. When Nintendo revealed the game, the world didn't react gently. The trailer played, showing a young, bright-eyed Link with animated expressions, a style now iconic, but shocking at the time. The audience's reaction was almost electric in its disappointment. People booed. They complained online. They begged Nintendo to cancel it. Zelda fans who dreamed of the realistic Space World demo, the darker vision shown earlier, felt betrayed. People mocked the art style, calling it childish, simplistic, unserious. The term Shelda became a joke used to insult the game before it released. Even inside Nintendo, some developers questioned the direction. Aonuma felt the weight of it all. He believed in the style. He knew the art direction had depth, charm, and emotional nuance. But it's never easy when the world tells you your dream is wrong. Still, he held the course. Wind Waker's art wasn't chosen to spite anyone. It was chosen because it allowed Zelda to express something new, a sense of freedom, of lightness, of visual poetry. But getting there wasn't easy. Development at sea, creativity, pressure, and limited time. The Wind Waker wasn't developed under peaceful conditions. The team was racing against time, trying to build an enormous ocean world with limited resources. The GameCube was powerful, but the scope of their vision stretched even its capabilities. Sailing across a connected world was a massive technical challenge. Creating expressive animation required entirely new pipelines. Designing dozens of islands meant constant iteration, and the schedule was brutal. Many ideas never made it. Entire dungeons were cut late in development. Some concepts were reshaped, others abandoned. Aonuma felt the pressure from every angle, fans demanding realism, a team needing direction, a deadline cutting away development time, and his own desire to prove himself as the rightful future of Zelda. But creative conviction carried him through. The team poured themselves into crafting an ocean that felt alive, a world where sunlight glimmered on waves, where seagulls circled overhead, where even the horizon seemed to breathe. They sculpted expressive faces, animations rich with personality, and a tone that felt like a bedtime story brought to life. Slowly, steadily, the world of Wind Waker took shape. Release, the world changes its mind. When the Wind Waker launched, the backlash softened, not because fans suddenly loved the art, but because the game itself was undeniable. The ocean was serene. The characters were warm. The story blended innocence with melancholy so quietly that players only realized its depth after the credits rolled. Reviews were strong. Critics praised its boldness. Players slowly came around. But what no one expected was that Wind Waker's art style would age better than almost any 3D game of its time. While realism from that era grew stiff and polygonal, Wind Waker stayed vibrant, timeless, soothing. It was a living canvas. Years later, players who once mocked the game spoke about it with affection, even reverence, and the art style that almost ended Aonuma's career became one of the most celebrated designs in Nintendo history. The unmade dream, Wind Waker 2, with the GameCube Zelda engine complete and the art style now beloved, the team prepared a direct sequel, Wind Waker 2. It was going to be darker than the first game, not grim, but more mature. Link was a little older. The world was heavier. The tone expanded on the emotional depth of the first game. But the dream didn't last long. Players still expected the space world style, something realistic, something gritty. Sales of Wind Waker, while good, didn't match Nintendo's expectations in Japan. The message was clear. People still wanted a realistic Zelda. So the project shifted. The sequel was canceled. And in the ashes of that cancellation, Twilight Princess began. For Aonuma, it was bittersweet. The style he believed in had been validated, but not enough to protect its future. Wind Waker 2 was lost, a game that existed in sketches, in prototypes, in the hearts of its creators, but never touched the world. Still, the lessons learned, expressive animation, emotional rhythm, creative risk-taking, would stay with him for the rest of his career. The Wind Waker era was many things: a wound, a triumph, a risk, a legacy, a dream mocked, then loved, a direction rejected, then cherished. It was also the chapter where Aonuma proved something important to himself, that Zelda didn't have to follow expectations. It didn't have to chase realism. It didn't have to imitate the past. It could reinvent itself, softly, boldly, beautifully. Twilight Princess, the road into shadow, the wolf that wasn't planned, and the Zelda made to mend a wound. If the Wind Waker was a bright sunrise full of color and softness, then Twilight Princess was the long shadow that stretched out behind it, a shadow cast not by darkness alone, but by expectation, longing, and the weight of a promise Zelda fans thought Nintendo had broken. This is the chapter where the tone of the Zelda series swung almost violently in the opposite direction. And that swing came not from corporate strategy or a marketing demand, but from something much simpler. Players asked for something, and for once, Nintendo listened. But the story isn't really about listening. It's about the creative path that opens when a team tries to reclaim trust. So tonight, let's drift quietly into the making of Twilight Princess, a journey that began in disappointment and ended with a game that felt like a dream pulled from the collective imagination of a generation. The reaction that changed everything Wind Waker was beloved, eventually. But in its own time, especially before release, the backlash struck deep. Even after the game came out and reviewers praised it, there was a lingering feeling inside Nintendo that fans were still carrying a bruise. Comments flooded message boards and magazines. When will Zelda go back to being serious? Why did Nintendo abandon realism? Where is the Zelda from the Space World demo? The company felt the pressure. Aonuma felt it most of all. He'd poured his heart into Wind Waker's expressive art style, believing it would open new paths for Zelda, and while it did, he couldn't ignore the voices calling out for something else. When the time came for the next Zelda, Aonuma made a decision that was equal parts compromise and curiosity. Fine, let's make it darker. Let's make it realistic. Let's see what happens when we walk into the shadow instead of away from it. Twilight Princess was born from that quiet, serious moment. The horse prototype, the origin of a new Zelda. Before the game had a title, before the world had shape, before Link had a model, there was a prototype. A simple idea built in an early engine. It was Link on horseback, fighting an enemy in a wide-open field. The prototype didn't last more than a few minutes. It wasn't meant to be played publicly. It was just a test, an experiment to see if Zelda's combat and movement could expand into something more dynamic, more cinematic, more fluid. But when Miyamoto saw it, he felt something spark. This feeling of momentum. This was the seed of the next Zelda. The horseback prototype became the heart of the new direction. It told the team what kind of world they needed to build. A world that didn't just allow horseback combat. It needed it. And that meant the world had to be large, wide, sprawling. A Hyrule that felt more real, more grounded, more textured than anything before. Twilight Princess wasn't built from a story idea. It wasn't built from a dungeon concept. It was built from a single moment of movement, from the motion of horse and rider against a shadowy horizon. The wolf that slipped into the story one of the strangest and most fascinating truths about Twilight Princess is that Wolf Link wasn't part of some long, carefully crafted story plan. He came from a dream. Aonuma had a vision, not a corporate-approved pitch, not a scheduled brainstorming moment, but a literal dream where Link transformed into a wolf. The idea was wild, unpredictable, not at all what you'd expect from a Zelda that was supposed to return to realism. But dreams have their own kind of logic, and Aonuma trusted his. He told the team about the dream. Instead of laughing or dismissing it, they grew intrigued. A wolf could unlock new gameplay, new dynamics, new emotions. And so Wolf Link was born, quietly, unplanned, unexpectedly, a creature built from intuition rather than logic. He became the emotional center of the game, a symbol of instinct, wilderness, and transformation. The shadow world, the twilight, grew around him. Midna's design grew beside him. The entire game shifted to embrace the duality between human and beast, light and shadow, surface and interior. A dream became a mechanic became a story became a world. The tone, a Zelda, painted in shadow twilight. Princess feels different the moment you step into it. The lighting is softer, duskier. The colors lean into muted earth tones. Faces are shaped with more seriousness, eyes more narrow, expressions more grounded. This wasn't Nintendo trying to be edgy. It was Nintendo addressing the simple truth that players wanted something atmospheric, something somber. But there's something important to understand. Twilight Princess isn't dark for the sake of darkness. It's melancholic. It's lonely. It's thoughtful. It feels like a Zelda made during autumn, a world where leaves fall slowly, stories hold quiet sadness, and the twilight sky rests gently over everything. Fans embraced it immediately. This was the Zelda they had imagined since Ocarina. A hero grown older, a world grown heavier, and for Aonuma, it felt like a way to mend the rift from Wind Waker. A way to show fans that he understood their longing, even if he didn't always agree with it. The Wii arrives, and everything changes again. Halfway through development, Nintendo announced something unexpected, a brand new console called the Wii, focused on motion controls and intuitive play. Suddenly, Twilight Princess wasn't just a Zelda game. It was being positioned as a launch title, a flagship. The game needed to support motion controls, sword swings, item aiming. A completely new control scheme layered on top of a game already deep in production. It was a monumental task. The team had to adapt the combat system, the camera, the targeting, even the UI to accommodate the Wii remote. They had to do it fast, and they had to do it without breaking the balance of the world. But in the end, they managed something surprising. 2 versions of the same Zelda game. One for the GameCube, one for the Wii, developed and released simultaneously. This had never been done before. It hasn't been done since. But there's a small detail many fans never realized. To make the Wii controls feel natural, the entire game world had to be mirrored. Left became right. Right became left. Every map, every path, every structure. A complete mirrored Hyrule, quietly hidden inside the Wii version. It's a strange secret, a quirk of development, almost poetic, considering the game's themes of duality. The weight and the relief of release. When Twilight Princess finally released, fans embraced it with open arms. It felt like a long-awaited answer, a promise finally fulfilled. Zelda was serious again. The art style was dramatic and grounded. The world was vast and lush. The story was emotional. The gameplay was layered. It became a success, not just commercially, but emotionally. For Aonuma, it meant something more intimate. He had earned the trust of the Zelda fandom again. He had proven that he could create on both ends of the emotional spectrum, whimsical and serious, bright and shadowed. But even in the triumph, he felt something shift inside him. Twilight Princess was everything fans asked for. But was it everything he wanted to make? That quiet question would eventually lead him toward Skyward Sword, and later, toward tearing down the entire Zelda formula to build Breath of the Wild. But that moment comes later. Tonight, we rest in the shadowed beauty of Twilight Princess, a game born from backlash, shaped by dreams, seasoned by urgency, and remembered with a softness that only grows with time. Skyward Sword, the weight of tradition, and the moment. Zelda reached its breaking point, very long, soft, reflective, fall asleep to style, all facts preserved. Twilight Princess had delivered the serious cinematic Hyrule fans asked for, and for a while, it felt like the Zelda series had found steady ground again. But beneath that calm surface, something was beginning to strain. It wasn't the fans, it wasn't the technology, it wasn't even the story direction. It was the formula itself, the familiar pattern Zelda had followed for decades. Dungeon after dungeon, key after key, puzzle after puzzle, locked door after locked door. It was structure that had served the series well, but also structure that was growing rigid. Aonuma felt it first. He loved Zelda deeply, but during the development of Twilight Princess, he began to sense that something was missing. Something was slipping away. It wasn't the magic. It wasn't the emotion. It was the freedom. And so, when it came time to build the next Zelda, Aonuma didn't begin with story or style or even concept. He began with a question. How do we refresh Zelda without losing what makes it Zelda? The answer would become Skyward Sword, a game filled with ambition, experimentation, and one of the most demanding control systems Nintendo had ever attempted. But to reach that answer, they would have to confront a lot of frustration first. The promise of precision. Enter the Wii Motion Plus. Nintendo introduced a new piece of hardware, the Wii Motion Plus, a little white block that plugged into the bottom of the Wii remote, giving it far more accurate motion tracking. With this device, motion controls could become something more than flicks and gestures. They could become precise, deliberate inputs, something that could mimic real swordplay. Aonuma saw potential in this, not a gimmick, not a party trick, but a way to make Zelda physical. Imagine a game where every sword strike wasn't a button press, but a movement, where enemies didn't just take damage, but responded dynamically to the angle of your blade. That was the dream, a bold one, a risky one. And so Skyward Sword became built around a single idea. Every motion matters. At least, that was the plan. The struggle. When technology and vision don't quite align. Skyward Sword's development became one of the most technically demanding projects in the Zelda team's history. This wasn't because the game was graphically intense or because the story was unusually complex. It was because the controls had to be perfect. Not good. Not acceptable. Perfect. If the sword didn't swing the exact way you intended, if the angle was off by even a little, if the tracking desynced for a moment, the game fell apart. And desync happened a lot. Developers wrestled with calibration issues, sensor bar distance, light interference, tiny details that could send sword movements spiraling into chaos. During internal playtests, people grew frustrated, sometimes angry, sometimes exhausted. Even seasoned testers struggled with it. And during that period, some at Nintendo whispered the quiet fear. What if this doesn't work? What if we can't make this fun? But Aonuma didn't let go. He held the vision tightly, the same way he had held Wind Waker's art direction against the tide of criticism. He believed that if players could just feel the connection, the sense of physically cutting through an enemy's guard, they would understand the magic. And in many ways, he was right. But the journey to get there wasn't peaceful. The fans pushed back. Again. When Skyward Sword released, reviews were strong, some glowing, some cautiously optimistic. Many praised the dungeons, many praised the story, many praised the expressive watercolor-like art style. But the controls? Those divided the audience. Players with perfect setups found them thrilling. Players with imperfect living room conditions found them maddening. Calibration issues frustrated people. Gestures failed to register. Combat sometimes felt like fighting the controller, not the enemy. And a new wave of fan criticism rose, different from the Wind Waker era, but just as intense. Some said the game handheld too much. Some said the tutorial pacing dragged. Some said the overworld felt segmented instead of open. Once again, Aonuma heard the disappointment. Once again, he carried it. But this time, the frustration didn't push him toward a darker tone or a new art style. It pushed him toward something deeper, a realization, a quiet, devastating realization. The Zelda formula itself was becoming a cage. Miyamoto's tough love moment. Near the end of Skyward Sword's development, Aonuma reached a point of deep exhaustion. He had given everything to the project. The motion controls, the dungeon intricacy, the narrative foundation that would become the origin of the entire Zelda timeline. But something felt wrong. Something felt heavy. And in a rare moment, he admitted that he wasn't enjoying the work anymore. Miyamoto, who had mentored him for years, said something that stuck. If you're not having fun, the player won't either. It wasn't a scolding. It wasn't a lecture. It was truth. A truth that hit Aonuma harder than he expected. He realized that Zelda had become too structured, too rigid, too predictable, too carefully guided. The puzzles were brilliant, but they were also safe. The dungeons were masterpieces, but they never surprised. The world was beautiful, but it wasn't exploratory. Players weren't discovering Zelda's secrets anymore. They were following instructions. Aonuma didn't want to build instructions. He wanted to build wonder. And so Skyward Sword, for all its beauty, became something more than a game. It became a turning point. The moment Aonuma decided Zelda had to change, truly change, or risk losing what made it magical. The quiet birth of a revolution. At the end of Skyward Sword's development, something unexpected happened. Instead of planning another traditional Zelda, instead of outlining more dungeons, instead of refining the standard formula, the team took a step back, and they asked a simple question. What if we start over? Not tweak, not adjust, not polish, start over. What if Zelda stopped telling you where to go? Stopped locking doors until you found a specific item? Stopped funneling you through one path at a time? What if Zelda became a world you could explore freely, like the very first game? Not nostalgia. Rebirth. The first sparks of Breath of the Wild appeared in that moment, in the disappointment, in the exhaustion, in the realization that the formula had served its time. Skyward Sword wasn't a failure. It was the necessary ending before a new beginning. Aonuma felt that deeply. He knew Zelda needed space to breathe again, to feel alive again, to feel wild again. The revolution was coming, quietly, gently, inevitably. The Breath of the Wild prototype, the little blue box world that changed Zelda forever. Reinventing a legend doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive in a single flash of inspiration. It begins quietly, usually with something small, almost unremarkable, something that wouldn't make sense to anyone except the people who built it. For Breath of the Wild, that something was a tiny, primitive, blue box world, a world that looked like a child's building blocks scattered across a table, a world that didn't resemble Zelda at all. And yet, it held the future of the entire franchise. This is the story of that strange prototype, the experiments it inspired, and the moment Zelda stepped out of its old formula and into a new era of freedom. A kingdom made of cubes. After Skyward Sword, The Zelda team needed to think differently. They were tired of the rigid structure, the hand-holding, the linear paths, the predictable item progression. They wanted a Zelda that felt alive again, one that breathed, one that surprised, one that welcomed wandering. But wanting change isn't enough. To discover what Zelda could become, they needed a space to play. So they built one. Not a polished Hyrule, not a lush field, just a grid-based cube-filled prototype. A world made of colored blocks, blue cubes for walls, orange cubes for cliffs, green cubes for grass. It looked nothing like a Nintendo game, more like an experiment in motion. And that's exactly what it was. In that simple, blocky landscape, the team rediscovered something they had forgotten: how fun it is just to move. No story, no dungeons, no instructions, just movement, just freedom, just possibility. What began as a rough sketch soon became the most important Zelda experiment ever created. What if everything had logic? The spark of the open-air philosophy. Aonuma and the team asked questions that felt almost childish in their simplicity. What if grass could burn realistically? What if fire created wind? What if wind pushed fire in a direction? What if trees fell? What if they rolled? What if they crushed enemies? What if metal conducted lightning? What if rain made climbing slippery? What if the cold made Link shiver? What if food mattered? What if weather wasn't decoration but behavior? These weren't features. They were truths, rules of a living world. And inside that blue box sandbox, they tested them one by one. They discovered that when you let systems interact freely, even a simple cube world becomes exciting. An enemy chases you. You set the grass on fire. Wind spreads the flames. The fire creates an updraft. You paraglide away. This wasn't scripted. It wasn't designed. It simply happened. That freedom became the heart of Breath of the Wild. Not because it was fashionable, not because it was requested, but because the developers themselves felt joy in watching a world behave with honesty. For the first time in years, Zelda felt surprising again. The team's new testing method, the upvote board. During development, the team used a method that almost sounds like something from an online forum. Whenever someone on staff discovered something fun in the prototype, an interaction, a weird behavior, a trick, a chain reaction, they wrote it on a sticky note and placed it on a giant whiteboard. Then the rest of the team would walk by, look at the idea, and literally upvote it with stickers. The more stickers an idea received, the more likely it was to make it into the final game. Breath of the Wild wasn't built from top-down design. It grew from hundreds of tiny, joyful discoveries, each one approved by the team because it sparked a smile. That's why the game feels playful. It wasn't assembled. It was cultivated. The hookshot that almost returned, and why it was removed. One of the biggest surprises during development was the early version of the hookshot. At first, the hookshot was meant to work in Breath of the Wild, not just as a tool, but as a way to scale cliffs and zip across the world with acrobatic flair. But something unexpected happened. When they tested it, it was too good. It broke the entire climbing system. Why climb when you can chain hookshots and fly from place to place like a superhero? Why observe terrain when you can skip it entirely? The hookshot didn't make the game richer. It made the game smaller. And so, with a little pain and a lot of discipline, the team removed it. A simple choice, but an important one, because the entire identity of Breath of the Wild is built on choosing to move through the world rather than over it. It's a reminder that reinvention isn't about adding more. It's about adding what matters. Kyoto. the quiet inspiration behind the world. As the open-air concept developed, the team began sketching environments, not from old Zelda maps, but from views outside the windows of Nintendo's Kyoto headquarters. Rolling green hills, slender forests, soft mountains in the distance, ancient shrines tucked behind trees. The land outside their office became Hyrule's backbone. Not copied, not traced, just felt. They wanted players to stand on a hill in the game and feel the same quiet awe that they felt when looking out at northern Kyoto. And that feeling, that gentle blend of nature, spirituality, and simple beauty, became one of the defining emotional pillars of Breath of the Wild. The game wasn't designed to be epic. It was designed to be peaceful. A place to breathe, a place to wander, a place to listen. The prototype that became a philosophy. The blue box test world didn't look like Zelda, but it felt like Zelda, in a way that the older formula had slowly stopped feeling. The prototype taught them 5 quiet truths. 1. Freedom makes exploration meaningful. 2. Systems create stories without scripts. 3. The world should respond to the player, not just contain them. 4. The player's curiosity should be rewarded instantly. 5. Zelda needed to let go of its old rules to discover new magic. And once the team felt those truths, truly felt them, there was no going back. Breath of the Wild wasn't just a new game, it was a new identity. Aonuma had found the answer to the question he'd asked at the end of Skyward Sword. How do we make Zelda feel alive again? The answer was waiting inside a world made of blue cubes. Hyrule's lost possibilities, the quiet dreams, abandoned ideas, and hidden concepts of Breath of the Wild. One of the most beautiful things about game development, especially for games as vast as Breath of the Wild, is that the versions we play are only one of many possible worlds. Before a system exists, it often has dozens of prototypes. Before a character becomes familiar, they go through many forms. Before a map becomes a landscape, it's sketched, erased, reshaped, and rewritten again. For every feature that makes it into a Zelda game, there are dozens that never do. Not because they were bad ideas, not because they failed, but because the game changed around them. Tonight, we're going to wander through those ghosts, the quiet ideas that flickered briefly through Breath of the Wild's development before fading away. They're soft, almost dreamlike, but they reveal how much care and curiosity went into building Hyrule. Let's walk together through the what-ifs of the wild. The early Terry Town that was never built before. Terry Town became the cozy, evolving community fans adore. It was something far more ambitious. The very first concept for Terry Town was almost like a miniature life simulator, a place where houses weren't placed for you. You built them yourself. A place where the town grew dynamically, not through scripted quests, but through choices, materials, and placement. Players would drag pieces of architecture across the land, set foundations, choose styles, design the town's shape. It was part city builder, part Zelda, part experiment. But the system was too powerful, too open. Players could break progression. They could build in bizarre locations. They could create situations the story couldn't handle. The idea was beautiful. But Breath of the Wild needed its freedom in the world, not in structured settlements. So the team reshaped it, softened it, turned Terry Town into something more linear, but still filled with heart. The town we got is warm and handmade. The town we almost got would have been alive in another way. A place players molded with their own hands. A quieter, more flexible dream that never found its final shape. Animals that once lived in Hyrule, but don't anymore. In the earliest plans, Hyrule was going to be far wilder than the version we explore today. More animals, more interactions, more chaos. Imagine flocks of birds migrating across the map. Imagine predators stalking herds. Imagine creatures reacting to rain, wind, heat, or even Link's scent. All of those ideas existed at one point. Some of them even worked. But Breath of the Wild systems were already extremely demanding. Fire physics, wind physics, climbing stamina, material interactions, temperature systems. Every new species added layers of behavior, AI, and interactions. The world began to feel too alive, too complex, too unpredictable. And so certain animals, including some designed purely to bring a sense of wilderness, and some that existed only as prototypes, were quietly set aside. Their models remained on development servers, their animations half finished, their footsteps never heard in Hyrule's grass, lost, but not forgotten. Divine beasts, the forms we never saw, before the divine beasts became the massive mechanical animals we recognize today. They went through many transformations. At one point, the divine beasts were going to be something closer to Zelda dungeons, full-scale moving fortresses, complex interiors with shifting rooms, unique shapes that weren't animals at all. But as the game took shape, the team realized that the beasts needed personality, identity, symbolism. They needed to represent the champions, so the grand machines became elegant creature forms: Vamado the bird, Varudania the salamander, Varuta the elephant, Vanaboris the camel. But those weren't their first shapes. Early prototypes explored dragons, floating fortresses, enormous humanoids, and even biomechanical insect-like designs. Each one was tested, shaped, redrawn, and ultimately set aside. The divine beasts we got weren't just chosen. They were earned through countless iterations. Their final forms feel inevitable, but they were once only one possibility among many. Champion designs that shifted with the story. The champions, Mipha, Revali, Daruk, and Urbosa, also changed dramatically throughout development. Early sketches show different personalities, Mipha being more stoic, Revali less prideful, Daruk more grizzled, Urbosa more playful. Their designs were pushed and pulled as the story shifted. Revali needed to be a foil to Link, so his arrogance sharpened. Urbosa needed to embody strength and grace, so her silhouette changed. Mipha needed to feel fragile, gentle, luminous, so her design softened. Daruk needed warmth, not just muscle, so his smile grew wider. Some champions originally had different weapons, different voices, different roles. In one draft, a fifth champion existed. In another, Mipha's storyline was far longer. In another still, Urbosa's past was more central. These pieces were refined and streamlined as the geography, memories, and divine beast arcs solidified. Characters evolve like stories, fluid, shifting, searching for their true form. The champions we met were once very different from the champions first imagined. Cut gameplay tools and abilities. During the game's experimental stage, when everything was still possible, the team explored dozens of abilities for Link. Some were whimsical, some were powerful, some were simply too chaotic. One early idea gave Link the ability to dive underground, bursting up beneath enemies like a subterranean warrior. Another gave him the power to bind metal objects together, creating makeshift machines long before Zonai constructs existed. And one incredibly ambitious prototype allowed Link to ride beams of light, a mechanic that warped level design so dramatically that the team set it aside for being too hard to balance. What remained, magnesis, cryonis, stasis, were the most stable ideas. the cleanest, the most readable. But behind them is a graveyard of fascinating prototypes. Breath of the Wild wasn't built by picking a few ideas. It was built by letting go of dozens of extraordinary ones. The early Hyrule that looked completely different. Before the world settled into its final shape, the layout of Hyrule changed constantly. The Gerudo Desert shifted from east to southwest. Zora's domain floated between multiple regions. The Great Plateau had different edges. Death Mountain's slopes changed shape. Lake Hylia moved locations. Entire mountain ranges appeared and vanished. At one point, Hyrule Castle stood in a forest. In another draft, it was perched on cliffs like a bird nest. The final placement, rising from a moat at the kingdom's center, wasn't decided until surprisingly late. The geography you know now is the result of countless quiet decisions, each one made to guide the player's eyes, their footsteps, their instincts. Game worlds aren't born whole. They crystallize slowly, like ice forming across water. The things that remained only as memories. Scattered through the development documents are traces of a musical instrument mechanic, a system where armor changed personality traits, mounts that could swim underwater, temples that rotated the entire screen, a crafting system far more complex than the final one, NPC factions that influenced the world dynamically, a giant bird that carried Link across entire regions, a forest maze that changed shape every night, a weather system that created regional disasters. None of these ideas survived, but each one, in its own quiet way, shaped the final game. Ideas don't disappear. They ripple through decisions. They resurface in sequels. They whisper from the edges of the world. The Zelda we play today is built on the bones of the Zelda that could have been. How Nintendo tested Breath of the Wild, quiet experiments, debugged dreams, and the search for pure fun. Breath of the Wild is one of the most carefully tested games Nintendo has ever made. Not because the team feared bugs or wanted technical perfection, but because they were chasing something much harder to measure. They wanted the game to feel good, not just work, not just function, not just behave logically. They wanted a world that rewarded curiosity intuitively, where every step, every climb, every gust of wind, every strange little encounter inspired a spark of childlike wonder. To reach that feeling, Nintendo had to develop a testing philosophy unlike anything they'd done before, especially for Zelda. It wasn't strict. It wasn't mathematical. It wasn't about checking boxes. It was closer to watching how people dream. Let's walk through that philosophy, slowly and softly, the way Nintendo observed their own developers as they played. The play-first philosophy. Most studios begin with logic, mechanics, rules, balance. Nintendo began with something simpler. If it isn't fun in its rawest form, it won't be fun later. The early prototype, the little blue cube world, made this philosophy possible. Developers could test an idea instantly without needing polished graphics or final systems. If a developer said, "What if trees fall realistically?" they built it. If someone wondered, "What if fire spreads uphill?" they tried it. If they asked, "What if metal attracts lightning?" they triggered a storm. Everything was fluid. Everything was experimental. Nothing was permanent. And because of that freedom, dozens of magical interactions were discovered accidentally, then preserved deliberately. Fun came first. Structure came second. This was the opposite of traditional Zelda. The upvote board, a playground for developers. As ideas emerged inside this prototype, Nintendo used a method that felt almost playful. Each time someone discovered something exciting, a physics trick, a funny chain reaction, a creative solution to a problem, They wrote it on a sticky note and placed it on a whiteboard. Other developers would walk by, try the interaction for themselves, and add stickers, literal upvotes. The most upvoted ideas became part of the real game. This wasn't a top-down design, it was communal, democratic in a quiet, creative way, a conversation among designers who were learning to rediscover joy in movement and surprise. It gave Breath of the Wild its soul, not crafted from one vision, but woven from hundreds. Debug mode, the secret garden of testing. Nintendo's debug builds are famous inside the company. They're not polished, they're not pretty, but they're playgrounds. Breath of the Wild's debug mode was exactly that. A space filled with switches, sliders, teleport tools, object spawners, weather triggers, and physics toggles. Developers would turn storms on and off instantly, spawn bokoblins in odd places, raise and lower mountains, test explosions on slopes, stack physics objects to see what broke, create wind tunnels, light forests on fire, just to observe the spread. Sometimes the game behaved beautifully. Sometimes everything collapsed in chaos. Both results were valuable. The debug garden of Breath of the Wild was where hundreds of small discoveries were made. Discoveries that shaped the world more deeply than any document could. These experiments weren't about stability. They were about character, about teaching Hyrule how it should behave when no one was watching. The great climbing debate. One of the biggest internal battles wasn't over enemies or weapons or story. It was over climbing. Some developers believed Link shouldn't be able to climb almost every surface. They worried it would break puzzles, remove challenge, prevent careful level design. Others, especially younger designers, felt it was liberating, that it made the world feel real, not staged, that it mirrored how children explore nature. Aonuma stood at the center of the argument. Climbing wasn't just a mechanic, it was a symbol of the game's new philosophy. Freedom, choice, exploration, verticality. In many ways, the ability to climb anything was the purest expression of Zelda's rebirth. Imagine those meetings, developers raising concerns, others defending the mechanic passionately, prototypes being tested, arguments gently unfolding, and then the compromise that settled everything. Yes, Link could climb nearly everything, but stamina would guide the challenge. This single decision shaped the entire game. It transformed mountains into puzzles, turned cliffs into stories, made weather meaningful, gave every region a personality expressed through vertical geometry, and the final touch, the rain, added nature's voice to the debate. A reminder that even the bravest explorer can't conquer everything by willpower alone. Why Breath of the Wild plays piano, not ocarina music, is the emotional breath of a Zelda game, and Breath of the Wild took a radically different direction from the series' tradition. Earlier, Zelda titles used memorable, melodic, iconic themes, songs you could hum, songs that defined eras. But Breath of the Wild wasn't designed to be hummed, it was designed to be felt. Koji Kondo and Manaka Kataoka made a decision that shaped the entire tone. Zelda no longer needed full, sweeping melodies everywhere. It needed space. It needed quiet. It needed the sound of wind, wildlife, and warmth. The piano became the perfect tool. A soft melody here, a gentle chord there, sparse notes that drift through the air like leaves falling slowly. There's a reason the music feels like memory rather than anthem. Hyrule is recovering. Hyrule is sleeping. Hyrule is dreaming. A loud soundtrack would have disrupted that softness. Some early experiments tried using the iconic ocarina again, but the sound felt too nostalgic, too tied to the past, too symbolic. The piano created something new, a world that is quiet enough for you to hear your own thoughts. A world where discovery isn't announced, it's whispered. The rule that guided every decision. As Breath of the Wild neared completion, one principle remained at the center of testing. If a player does something unexpected, the world should respond honestly. That rule made the world feel alive. If you drop a metal sword in a storm, lightning finds it. If you roll a boulder down a cliff, enemies scatter. If you cook too many spicy peppers, heat overwhelms the dish. If you set grass on fire, wind spreads the flames. If you shield surf, slopes become playgrounds. If you throw a weapon, enemies may pick it up. Every reaction made the world feel more real, more respectful of player curiosity, more full of wonder. It's why Breath of the Wild feels both enormous and intimate. A world big enough to explore endlessly, yet responsive enough to feel personal. The lost corners of Ocarina of Time, quiet experiments, abandoned temples, and the chaos behind a legend. Ocarina of Time is often remembered as something monumental, a masterpiece carved in stone, flawless and inevitable. But the truth is softer, stranger, and much more human. The game wasn't born perfect. It was born through dozens of experiments, mistakes, rewrites, abandoned designs, and moments where the team wasn't sure if any of it would work. If you could walk through the early development rooms of Ocarina of Time, you wouldn't find legendary confidence. You'd find sketches, theories, and prototypes, quiet attempts at turning dreams into something players could touch. Tonight, we're going to step into those rooms, quietly, slowly, like wandering through a museum of ideas that never made it to release. Some of these facts feel like myths. Some feel like accidents. Some feel like glimpses into alternate versions of Zelda that almost existed. But they're all part of the tapestry that became Ocarina of Time. The motion capture that began with a ballet dancer. Long before Link swung a sword with clean 3D animations, the team experimented with something the gaming world barely understood at the time: motion capture. But they didn't call in martial artists or stunt actors. They brought in a professional ballet dancer. They wanted Link's movements to feel graceful, fluid, heroic, not stiff or robotic. The dancer performed spins, jumps, rolls, and turns in a small studio while early mocap equipment captured the motion. The animations were rough. The technology was unfamiliar. The dancer had to mimic sword fighting without a sword, and the mocap suit wasn't nearly as advanced as modern ones. Most of the dancers' performances didn't survive to the final game. They were too fluid, too expressive, too different from the practical gameplay style needed. But those early recordings influenced the animators, teaching them to design Link's actions with a sense of weight, momentum, and elegance. The mocap didn't make it to the cartridge, but the dancer's spirit did. Young Link was inspired by Leonardo DiCaprio. It sounds like a rumor, the kind of strange trivia whispered between fans, but it's true. During early development, the art team struggled with designing young Link. They wanted him to be cute, but not childish, brave, but not aggressive, innocent, but not simple. Someone suggested referencing a popular young actor at the time, Leonardo DiCaprio. This was peak Romeo plus Juliet and Titanic DiCaprio, youthful, expressive, and instantly recognizable. His facial structure, the softness in the cheeks, the big eyes, the delicate balance between youth and determination, influenced the early drawings of young Link. If you look closely, you can still feel a hint of that 1990s Hollywood charm in Link's design. It's subtle, but it's there. A ghost of inspiration hidden beneath Hyrulean green. The Temple of Light, the dungeon that never materialized. One of the biggest missing pieces from Ocarina's development is the elusive Temple of Light, a dungeon that existed conceptually but never made it into the final game. In the early story structure, Link would awaken in the Temple of Light when he pulled the Master Sword, and the temple itself would serve as a full, explorable dungeon. But development time was limited. The story flow was already complex, and integrating another major temple became too heavy a burden. So the Temple of Light faded into the background, becoming more of a narrative concept than a physical place. Instead, players were transported directly to the Chamber of Sages, a simpler, more symbolic environment. The Temple of Light still lives quietly in the lore, but its physical form is one of Zelda's great what-ifs, a place we can imagine, but never explore. Unused temple concepts. Ocarina of Time went through many ideas that were partially built and later abandoned. There were early plans for a wind temple, an ice temple, and temple ideas that blended elemental themes in ways later games would explore. Some rooms existed only as test chambers. Some existed as early sketches. Some existed as geometry and development builds before being overwritten. The Spirit Temple once had multiple versions. The Shadow Temple had darker scenes that were softened before release. Dungeon items and puzzles shifted constantly. Pieces of these abandoned ideas survived, sometimes becoming rooms in the final game, sometimes resurfacing in future titles like Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, or even Skyward Sword. The ocarina we know today is only one arrangement of the ideas the team explored. There were many others, drifting like lost dreams just beyond the edges of the cartridge. The localization chaos, including the French mishap. Localization for Ocarina of Time was rushed, chaotic, and full of unusual challenges. Nintendo's teams in America and Europe were working with a game still in development, scripts changing daily, cultural references that didn't translate cleanly, technical limitations on text space, and deadlines that left almost no room for error. In the French version of the game, one infamous mistake slipped in. A vulgar line that wasn't meant to be there. It was an accident arising from placeholder text and translation misunderstandings. The line was quickly patched in later versions, but early copies still contain it. Localization is rarely glamorous, often messy, often frantic. But in Ocarina's case, it became part of the game's hidden history, a reminder that even masterpieces are shaped by human hands under intense pressure. The running man, that always wins players, long wondered whether it was possible to beat the running man in a race. The answer, unavoidably, intentionally, is no. The developers hard-coded him to always finish exactly 1 second before Link, no matter what path or strategy the player uses. This wasn't cruelty. It was teaching. The running man was designed to represent an unbeatable challenge, something that exists not to frustrate, but to humble. A quiet lesson in limits, in patience, in the idea that some victories aren't meant to be won. A concept Zelda often returns to. The strange animation tests. Before Link had his final animations, the team tested early skeletal rigs using placeholder characters. One test used a bizarre, blocky figure nicknamed the Stalfos Man, which moved with exaggerated joints and jerky angles. Another used a stretched-out version of Link with limbs far too long for his body, a puppet-like creature that looked more unsettling than heroic. These animation tests helped the team understand how the engine handled physics, weight, and articulation. None of the tests survived the final cut, but their existence helped shape the fluid animations that would define Link's movement for decades. Navi's dialogue was a last-minute patch. Navi, the fairy whose voice echoes through gaming history, was originally much quieter. Early testers got lost easily. The world was enormous. The objectives weren't always clear. Some puzzles felt too vague for younger players, so Navi's guidance was expanded. More hints, more reminders, more listen, more hey. It was never meant to be intrusive. It was meant to be friendly. But late development decisions often create loud changes, and Navi's voice became one of the most recognizable and debated parts of the game. A quiet farewell to Hyrule's hidden stories. As we come to the end of this long, gentle journey through the forgotten corners of Zelda's history, it's worth pausing for a moment and letting everything settle. All the ideas, all the secrets, all the strange little experiments that shape the worlds we've grown to love. Zelda is often celebrated for its heroes, its stories, its iconic music, and its massive worlds. But tonight, we explored something quieter, the parts of Zelda that most players never see, the prototypes, the debates, the dreams that lived only on paper, the features that flickered briefly before being replaced, the characters that almost looked different, the temples that were never built, the ideas that shaped the games from beneath the surface. We walked beside the developers as they questioned old traditions, tested impossible ideas, wrestled with deadlines, argued over mechanics, and made decisions that would ripple across decades of Zelda storytelling. We drifted through abandoned dungeons, empty concept art rooms, untextured landscapes, and little blue cube worlds that held the seeds of reinvention. And through all of it, one quiet truth emerged. Zelda grows because the people behind it never stop exploring. They explore ideas, they explore worlds, they explore themselves, and we, as players, get to explore the worlds born from those quiet, persistent dreams. Every Zelda game carries the fingerprints of the ones that came before it, even the unfinished ones. Somewhere inside Breath of the Wild lives the shadow of an unused hookshot. Somewhere inside Ocarina lives the echo of a ballet dancer's movement. Somewhere inside Majora lives the exhaustion and brilliance of a one-year miracle. Somewhere inside Wind Waker lives the courage to ignore criticism and follow beauty. Somewhere inside Twilight Princess lives a dream about a wolf. Somewhere inside every Zelda game lives a little piece of the developers who shaped it with patience, curiosity, and sometimes fear. These games don't appear fully formed. They grow, they change, they stumble, they rise, just like the people who make them, just like the players who play them. And maybe that's why Zelda feels different from other series. Not because the games are perfect, but because they're human. They hold the marks of uncertainty, the warmth of collaboration, the quiet bravery of reinvention, the gentle magic of imagination refusing to fade. So as we close this long, calm journey, think of Zelda not just as a series of adventures, but as a living history, one shaped by risks, by dreams, and by people who kept trying even when they didn't know the answers yet. And think of yourself drifting peacefully now, carrying all these stories with you. A world of forests, oceans, deserts, and skies waiting behind your eyelids. A kingdom built from ideas, yours, mine, and theirs, blending into a soft, peaceful haze. If your eyes are heavy now, let them rest. If your breath has slowed, let it deepen. If the world feels quiet, stay in the quiet a little longer. Hyrule will always be here, in games, in memories, and in the quiet spaces of imagination we return to when we need comfort or inspiration. Thank you for walking through these hidden stories tonight. Thank you for wandering gently through the dreams behind the legend. Until next time, may your path be calm, may your heart stay curious, and may you always find a little piece of Hyrule wherever you go.